constantly talking about why you should move to New York City and how to move to New York City. But at the same time, I never really talk about why I personally moved to New York City. So I always say to people that New York City is such a great career move for most people. But at the same time, I personally think that it's so much more than that as well. So basically, as long as I can remember in my life, I was always obsessed with New York City. Honestly, ever since I was a kid. So I used to be that kid who used to do anything in the world to get my parents to bring me to New York City on the weekends. Like, there was a point in time where literally I was going to New York City almost every weekend as like a preteen teenager. And for those of you who don't know at this point, I grew up in Connecticut. So of course that was definitely more attainable compared to if I lived somewhere else in the United States or even in the world. So where I grew up was probably about an hour and a half outside of the city, maybe a little bit longer if you're taking like public transportation, which is the local train here. I would say that by the age of 12 was the age I knew that I wanted to live in New York City. So you know when kids are younger and they kind of talk about like their dream life, like who they're going to marry, like the house they're going to have one day. I never did that. I always knew ever since I was a kid that I didn't want the American dream house that everybody else wanted. I didn't want a house in the suburbs. I didn't want the picket fence. I grew up in the suburbs, but I just knew that long term, that wasn't my dream. That was really other people's dream. Because of that, I always felt like, especially where I grew up, I always felt like a black sheep because I grew up in that perfect suburban world and I wanted nothing to do with it. So when I was younger, preteen, teenage, it was really hard for me to be social in my small town because honestly, I was just really, really disinterested. I had no interest in being there. I wanted nothing to do with it. And I just couldn't stop thinking and talking about New York City. That's all I ever wanted. So I always knew at that point that I was going to be in New York City at some point. So my sister actually reminded me of this, and I completely forgot about this in my life, that I used to go to the public library in my small town and I used to just check out stacks of books about New York City. I completely forgot about this for years, but here I was like, I don't know, 11, 12, 13 years old, and I was just like reading books about New York City. I mean, not to age myself, but like, not like the internet was like this gigantic thing at this point. It existed and people were Googling things and YouTube was like just starting, but at the same time, it wasn't like anything near what it was today. So like people were still reading books and apparently that's what I was doing as well. So I knew that I was going to come to New York City at some point, but I didn't know when. When it came down to colleges, of course, I was obsessed with going to college in New York City. Now, I did apply to schools outside of New York City as well, but I knew I wanted to be in New York City. That's always where I wanted to be. So I got into a school in New York City. I got into Pace University here in the city campus, because they also have one outside of the city as well. And I was so excited to potentially go to this school. I got in early admission. I got some type of, I think, small scholarship that hardly made a difference, but it was nice to have at least because it was a private school. And I was ready to go to Pace. Like that was my school. I was set on it. And during this time, right after I got like that early admission, my dad actually got very sick at this time and ended up having to get open heart surgery. Here I was, 17 years old, so excited that I'm leaving Connecticut and finally going to move to New York City. And my dad is really, really sick and needs heart surgery and can't work. At one side, my dream is happening. On the other side, everything's falling apart in my life in Connecticut. And I did not know what to do. So at 17 years old, you want to follow your dreams, of course, but at the same time, you don't want you following your dreams to affect everybody else in your life. It's a hard place to be. So what happened here was I decided, because my dad couldn't work and because I knew that finances were going to be affected during this time, I ended up making the decision by almost towards the end of my senior year to not go to Pace and go to a very small school in Connecticut instead, because the price difference. It was a small state school versus Pace University, which my little scholarship wasn't going to help anything. I decided not to go to Pace, and I decided not to go to New York City at that point. And it was very, very hard for me in the beginning. I had no interest in staying in Connecticut, as you can tell from this video, and I ended up staying in Connecticut all 4 years for college. Looking back at it, I don't regret that time at all, and I do think that it was probably the right move at that time for me, but it was really, really hard because I did want to be in New York City during that time. And I do also think now that if I moved to New York City when I was 18 instead of when I was 23, which is when I ended up moving, I think that I would have been a very, very different person if I made that move earlier versus now, or versus then when I was 23. So that's a little bit of my backstory. But I graduated college. I got a job actually in Connecticut first because I was having a really, really hard time getting a job in New York City. So I took that job in Connecticut for a little under a year until I was able to then start working in Manhattan. I did get here eventually, but it took some time. And if I had it my original way, I would have been here at 18, but instead I ended up being here in my early 20s. But like I said, I think that everything works out for a reason. And I do think that I would have been a very different person if I moved too early versus when I moved to the city. And like I said, New York City is the dream place to have a career in so many different fields. And that was my goal as well. I was so excited to move to New York City and have my dream career. Now, funny enough, I went to school for marketing and I always thought I was going to work in advertising. That was like my goal, my dream. When I started working in advertising for my first job out of college, I then realized how much I did not like working in advertising, and everything that I thought advertising wasn't to me what I thought. It just wasn't the right fit for me at all. And I know personally people who have advertising careers and absolutely love it. It just was not a good fit for me at all. So I've worked in a lot of different industries in my 20s, and I ended up going into residential real estate, which is what I do now. And I couldn't be happier, but it took me a long time to get there. So not only do I think that New York City changed my my career, but I also think that New York City made me a better person as well. I think that when you're living in New York City, you're around so many different people, different lifestyles, and you're just not in a bubble like sometimes you are in these small towns in America or really all over the world. So I love the diversity of New York City. I can't get enough of it, honestly. So it really made me a better person. There was a time in my life where I actually left New York City and moved back to Connecticut, and I completely regretted it and ended up coming back. And that made me realize that New York City is the place that I want to be for the rest of my life. At least now I do. And so I do plan to be here for a very long time. So I hope sharing a little bit of my backstory kind of helped you, because I know that there's so many people in the world really who are going through similar situations that I went through, or have a strong desire to live in New York City but feel out of place because they don't know anybody else who also has that desire. I was that person even in Connecticut. When Connecticut is so close to New York City, I was around people who just couldn't understand why I would ever want to live in New York City. And to this day, they still don't understand why I live in New York City, and I don't think they ever will, and I'm okay with that. But that's just how it is sometimes, and it's okay for you to feel like that. Like I said, I hope this video helped you. And if you guys have any stories to share, I would love if you could share them in the comments, because as always, I love hearing from you guys.